Welcome to Voices of the Gascoyne, the podcast series where we delve into the remarkable stories of the pastoralists who came before us. These men and women face their fair share of challenges, from day-to-day aspects of communication, transport and electricity, to natural disasters, market collapses, and the impacts of government policy. In this series, we reflect on their journeys and capture insights that can only be gained from having made it to the other side. You'll hear stories of their unacknowledged resilience. For them, it was simply life, but for us, it serves as both inspiration and a chance to learn for the future. Voices of the Gascoyne is a Gascoyne Catchments Group project made possible through support from FRRR's Helping Regional Communities Prepare for Drought initiative, funded by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. In this episode, we speak to Locky and Jane McTaggart, who called Bidgumire Station home for over 4 decades. They say they've lived a big life, and they mean it. Together, they endured the challenges of life in the bush, the ones that were part and parcel of working in agriculture, like drought and death, and those that they could never have seen coming. A catastrophic flood which almost destroyed everything they spent their lives working for. Throughout it all, Locky and Jane have raised a family, built a community, and created a legacy that runs strong today. To start our conversation, I asked Locky to take me back to where it all began.
Well, from all accounts, I was an excellent child. I was in love with a fair bit of strife, and eventually at 8, 9, I was sent away to boarding school. But up until then, there was a series of governesses that didn't make it. And my friend was the Gascoyne River, which was not very far away from anywhere there might be a schoolroom or a classroom. I do remember dodging whoever was the hapless governess and around my mother, and if I ran really quickly straight into the river, there's plenty of pads that went into the river, and then I could hide for most of the day. Of course, that wasn't doing much from education, as you might imagine, but I'd leave, particularly following my father. And I do remember some of those journeys I'd take off, and one of the things that I managed to do on the way was disrobe, and if I went far enough, I would literally end up naked, and I'd be recaptured and taken home. But like all these things, as early life experiences, there were some consequences to all this. And my father was never all that impressed having to come home and deal with the discipline, and that went on until I went to boarding school and after. So I got to a place called Locky Creek, which is not far from Gascoyne Junction, so I've got sort of 3-4 miles away. And I'd certainly, where he'd go to do a job that was a bit closer, 1 mile, there was an old 1 mile tank there that they were, and I'd get as far as that. But then when I got there was always a bit of a mixed blessing, that, because when I got there, there'd be trouble, because I actually wasn't supposed to be there. But it didn't really deter me much, I don't think.
So from a young age, you just wanted to be outdoors on the station working alongside
Absolutely,
Dad?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How did you handle going away to boarding school then at the age of 9?
Like all the kids of that vintage, most of us handled it really badly, actually. Like we'd come from a very idyllic lifestyle, really, and then, we all got measles and mumps and all the things that probably some of us got the first cold we'd ever had in our lives. And so it was a pretty miserable start for most of us. But look, there's kids a lot younger than I was went away. There's lots of kids went away when they were 6 and 7, but I was in the pack there around about that 8, 9, and pretty homesick. I mean, I didn't have a pair of shoes with laces in them. I had boots and I was barefooted, so I didn't actually when I I used to put a knot in my shoelaces and just poke them down the side of my shoes, it was a bit of a wake up, and never enjoyed it till the day I left. I enjoyed some of the camaraderie, but I railed against the system. Plenty of hidings and of course corporal punishment. Well, without it, I mean, there'd be basically been riots in half those big boarding schools. But so liberal amounts of corporal punishment was part of the thing. It was all over. You got 3 on the tail or 4 on the tail, and that was the end of it. You turned a page, and most of those old masters did the same thing. Some of them held a grudge, and they turned out to be people that you would consider pretty miserable sort of personalities today. And there was some of those. A lot of them were pretty good blokes, but they'd belt you. Do this and do it now. That's what they meant. The whole system, there was nothing very voluntary about any of it. The whole system was pretty compulsory. My parents were fully in charge of whatever I was going to do next.
So what were your parents' plans for you when you finished school?
My father was adamant that I got a university education, but that part of it became I think a bit of a disappointment, as sons can be to their fathers. Yeah, I didn't. I sort of renounced any real opportunity to be well educated, and I was given the opportunity essentially, but I was always wanting to go back to the north. That's where I wanted to go. I mean, he didn't rail about things like that. He wasn't that sort of person, but he had that happy knack of displaying disappointment by not actually saying anything at all. A few tut-tut-tuts maybe and a pretty glassy stare, but that's all. He never raised his voice much. It was very, very disquieting, and it had a similar effect. But after I left school, I went back to Bidgemire for about, it wasn't 12 months, but I was essentially allowed to go home, if you like. And then one evening after shearing had finished, it was a big, big shearing and a pretty reasonable year. That would have been 1970, 71, somewhere around about there. And he and my cousin, Sandy McTaggart, was the manager, and Dad was he was the big head kahuna sort of thing. Now they'd had managers actually on site for several years at that stage. And my mother and he had moved to Mouchet. They had a block and built a house at Mouchet. He flew up and down. He was a great aviator, and he used to fly up and down and generally create a certain amount of havoc, I think. He certainly did when I eventually went back there and managed the place for his family. It was a family property of which he was the manager and a principal in the family business. And, I was sort of told in the office, the manager behind the desk, leaning on something or sitting on the end of a couple of desks, and said that, it was time I moved on. And I remember being absolutely, I was pretty upset about that. I'd actually essentially, I'd got the don't come Monday. So a friend of mine who I'd been to school with, and a lifelong old friend, we bought an AP6 Valiant Ute for $400 and went and got a job via an uncle on an Elders Gosmort property in northern New South Wales for 18 months. And then I subsequently spent it was 8 years, and I had a pretty good look around Australia and worked our way around and came back in 77, ended up with a job as the manager of Bidgemire.
How was it being away from Bidgemire the second time around? Were you homesick the whole time?
No, not at all. I wasn't hankering to get home at all. In fact, I was a bit despondent. I was a little bit wary about going back to Bidgemire. The economics were very, very sus, and the seasons weren't all that good. And I'd certainly seen a lot of better country than Bidgemire. In fact, most of it's better than that part of the world, without being too derogatory about the northwest. There is places you can go there where you'd be able to make a living, in cattle or sheep or, whatever you like. So, I went back with my eyes wide open.
It was during his years away from Bidgymire that Locky met his future bride. Jane was a farm girl from the nearby community of Deniliquin. But just because she grew up on a farm, that didn't mean that she was prepared for life at Bidgymire.
So I came over to Perth to work for a year before we became engaged, and went up to Bidgymire a few times. And it was a bit glorified then, wasn't it? You're going up there for a holiday, and, you know, things were put on hold a bit on the station, and maybe it was around the Gascoyne Junction races or some event that was on there. And so it was really good fun. And I really don't think I thought about it too much when I was asked to go there, that I just thought it was, you know, you're young, aren't you? And you can just embrace it all, I suppose.
So you're going there for the, you know, the crux of the social season, the good weather.
Yeah,
it's all
in the good
big
times.
Romantic holiday
Yeah,
at this point in time. You don't,
Yeah,
I guess you're not thinking about what it's going to be to live there full time.
Yeah. And then we became engaged, and we were married in Melbourne, went on a honeymoon, and into my first summer at Bidgymire. And that could have taken the edge off it, I think, a little bit. You know, the realistic side of it was there was, 32 volt power, which I'd never heard of before. Generators that ran for a couple of hours in the morning and a couple of hours at night. Staff everywhere. Fairly menial conditions, rarely. And no air conditioners. Sleeping outside at night. And it was a bit of a shock to the system, but you're young and you just sort of cope with it, don't you? And that was just my life, and I just settled into it.
So the honeymoon was well and truly over in one sense?
The honeymoon disappeared fairly quickly, but we just stepped into work, really, and just did what you had to do.
Tell me about this power, 30-something volt, did you say?
32 volt. So 32 volt power was the wiring that could run lights only. And do we have a 32 volt generator, Locky, to run those? Yeah, to run the battery so we could run lights at night. And we had 32 volt fans, and it was just the really basic electricity there.
So was it like a more, like you couldn't have like the radio going and the fans going, the lights going all at once? Like it was a more delicate.
Yeah.
Lower,
telephones, we had an exchange at Gascoyne Junction, and that ran from 9 o'clock in the morning till lunchtime, an hour off at lunch, and then it closed at 5. So that was our telephone. That was probably the biggest shock to the system, really. And you just got used to it, didn't you? I was young. You just did what you had to do. So I think we had 32 volt irons from memory.
So you've almost stepped back in time a little bit, because you grew up on a farm. So it's not like you were a princess coming from the city with all the luxuries of life. Like you're a farm girl, but this is
farm kids, and
it's a whole new type of farm.
Bit more modern.
Yeah.
There was at that stage there was the basic rudiments of 240 volt power, today's power, AC power, and there was eutectic tank fridges.
We had a eutectic.
So there was, but it was very limited. And limited in time, so there was a few hours in the morning. People could use an ordinary 240 volt washing machine to wash, old Mrs. Simpson washed a few. And these eutectic tank fridges, which had hold. So there was no cool rooms as such, but there was, so 240 was moving into the bush. It was there when I went there, but
it was only run.
But it was a very limited amount of power, so you did rely on this 32 volt a lot, and it was 32 volt globes, and it was like 12 volt globes today. I mean, they were just a thing, and they got to be a bit like candles. It got to be a cottage industry pretty quickly, and then disappeared from view.
So, I mean, you had a big adjustment to make in that sense, Jane, of just, I guess, the way the station ran. But how did you also go, I guess, adjusting, fitting into a family business and being so far away from your own family?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't really think I gave it, I've never given it any thought, really, but I got on so well with the family that you just blended in and did what you had to do. cooked a lot, cooked for staff. I think we were paid, the wives in the company, the family company, were paid $12 a month or a week. I can't remember. That was the gesture. I was young. I just did it. Yeah, just got on with it.
So would you attribute your age, I guess, as a part of how you adjusted to things?
Yes, definitely. Definitely a bit naive, maybe. But I think so. I think you just couldn't think too hard about what you were doing. You just did it, did the best you can, worked as hard as you can, resolved the issues that came to you every day as best you could, and just got on with it, I suppose.
So I have to ask, I guess, to dig into that a little bit. How do you do that though? How do you not get, swept up in being homesick and, oh, woe is me, and this is, I hate this, or I don't like this, or this isn't working, or I just want to go home to my 24-hour power and all my friends and go down to the pub, because you can't, do that when you're out now in the middle of nowhere.
No, but because I had kids fairly quickly after we were married, I think you just got involved in your life there. Of course, we had so many people around us with the staff, constant staff. You actually got involved in all the different things that were happening around, and you didn't have time to think like that. Of course, I would have got homesick. I got homesick for my parents and my sister and all my friends at home, but I had so much to do and I just got on with it. Simple, really, isn't it? It was just a life, and I thoroughly enjoyed it when I was young. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I enjoyed the challenge, actually.
So having staff there and other people around, that was because you're obviously on a large property, neighbours are far away, but you do have a number of people living there. Was that, again, an important piece of the puzzle to making it work?
Yes, and keeping everyone happy. I was thrown in the deep end. We had a lot of staff, always had staff there. And of course, you have to feed the staff breakfast, lunch, smoko dinner, and a fairly substandard kitchen, really, when I think about it now. But it didn't worry me at the time. And you just had to sort of fit in. And actually, I'm worried more about the staff than anything. And it's quite incredible how I think I've spoke to a lot of people, the women up there, and they all say the same. You're focused on the staff more than your own family, and a lot of times trying to keep them happy and together and keep them well fed. And that was just how it all worked. And I probably expected of us, but I hadn't thought of it like that before.
Was it almost like a catch-22, like the staff, you have this built-in kind of extra family there and friends, like all this company, but at the same time, they're almost the bane of your existence because you're there, like, you've got to feed them 5 times a day. I'm sure you've got to sort out problems between them,
Nurse.
Yeah. The nurse, the pseudo mum, everything else.
Yeah.
So it's great to have them, but then they come with all these other issues too.
My word, they did. And they ran your life, actually, when I think about it. And we were more preoccupied with trying to keep that all together and happy. And it was a community. It was, there'd be nothing to have 20 staff there. Be nothing to feed 20 people, and especially at shearing time. And it was very important to keep it all together and keep it a happy place.
When did Bidjamaya start to feel like home to you?
Look, that's a good question. Funny, before I said going home back to Denny, I call it home now, funnily enough. Bidjamaya home now. Possibly, maybe when we converted into cattle and things became just slightly easier financially after a while, and, the kids were all settled. Yeah.
Yeah.
Children made our home.
So that's a good, probably almost 15 years after you moved there, maybe you moved into cattle. So
sheep were our busy times. You needed a lot of staff. And when we had the sheep, we had a lot of staff constantly, friends, a lot of people. And as I said, it ruled your life.
Yeah.
And when that became easier, you had more time. It sounds terrible to concentrate on your own family and children. It's all a bit of a blur to me. But the kids went to school in Gascoyne Junction. For a few years, Hamish went off to boarding school early, a bit earlier than he should have. He had a disease in his hips and he had to attend physio and things, and in Perth. So he went to school a bit earlier, and then the school closed down in Gascoyne Junction, and the two girls were taught at home with governesses. So I think that's probably when we really homed in. You know, you really homed in. You had time for your kids. Sounds dreadful, but it's had a lot of time for my kids, really. But, you know, you really could focus on them. And
I think, I suppose lots of people at different stages in their life have these periods of time where you're just trying to, you know, everything looks calm on the surface, but your little duck feet are paddling underneath trying to keep things running.
Yeah, it was.
But it's interesting to me that you were there for such a period of time before, I guess it felt like home. And I'm not saying that it wasn't at all home before that, but just to show that it comes at different times to different people, and that if it hasn't come in, you know, the first year or 2 years, 3 years, that it doesn't mean that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
So
we bought the place. What year was it, Locky? We bought Bijumar, and I think that's probably when I was able to put my stamp on the homestead and gardens. We had our own money to put, well, we didn't have a lot of money, but we had our money to change a few things, and it really became ours. And maybe that's when I really started to call it home, when I could put my own stamp there. I would say that was a pretty defining time for making it feel homely, because we could put our own stamp on it.
And you mentioned before Hamish had something with his hips, a medical issue. How was that being out remote and having to deal with that?
He had a disease in his hip called Perthes disease. And of course, we didn't know. We had no idea. He struggled with his hip for quite a few weeks until we went to a doctor. Then he was referred to Perth, and then he has had some major operations on his hip. It was a pretty tough time. I had spent a lot of time in Perth with him. He was in hospital for many, many, many weeks. And I suppose Locky looked after the two girls at home. But yeah, it was a pretty tough time because you don't really know, you know, the ramifications of all of that. And then he got osteomyelitis in his shoulder. And yeah, he was a sick boy for quite a while. So he went off to boarding school quite young.
Did that make that even harder for you?
It was terrible. Because I'll never forget the day I left him there. I'll never forget it in my life. And he looked so small. Yeah, it was tough. Yeah, because he was not well.
So it's hard. I mean, I think for any parent sending their child to boarding school is tough. But then if your child's sick, then on top of that, again, it's like all these things adding up.
So in 92, I had a pretty rough period. My parents died 10 days apart from each other in Deniliquin. They both had cancer. And our kids were, the girls were very young. And that was a really tough time in my life then. And so that's all a bit of a blur. I can't remember how old the kids were, but they were pretty young. Had to go backwards, a big effort to go backwards and forwards to Deniliquin. It was a drive into Carnarvon on the dirt road, Carnarvon to Perth, Perth, Melbourne, Melbourne to Deniliquin. Deniliquin to Melbourne was 3.5, 4 hours drive. And no sooner had Mum died, I went back to Bijumaya. The day I got back to Bijumaya, I heard that Dad had died, so I had to go back. That was a pretty tough time in my life there. Came back to Bijumaya in June. It was in June. And we were sharing. Step into that kitchen and just off you go again. You know, back into it. And you didn't have much time to reflect on some of those things like Hamish and Mum and Dad dying. You just had to get on with your work and your life and just push through all of that. You know, it's just what happened.
I guess that's that kind of catch-22 I was alluding to before. Like, it's great you've got all the people there in the company, but sometimes you probably just wanted some time to yourself and some space, some privacy to yourself to go and mourn what's happened.
I took me a year to mourn, really. as it turned out. Yes, it did. You just had to get through that year and what you were doing at the time, and then eventually you'll crack. And then once I got that over and done with, I was right. But it shows you how strong your mind is, or can be, to put things aside and just, yeah.
Would you say that's something you learnt from, for if anything happened in the future, to deal with it kind of sooner? And did you recognize at the time that that's what had happened, that you just kind of kept yourself busy for that year until it all built up?
Yeah. And I still do it today. I can easily put things aside in one side of my brain and just leave that festering there for a while.
So maybe we haven't learnt the lesson.
No, I can easily do it. It's simple for me.
Being on the station, it sounds like it was very busy, particularly during those years. What was, I guess, an average, or use the air quotes, year like at Bidjamaya? How did it work?
Well, there's some commonality with the seasonal aspects of a place in the Upper Gascoyne, or in the north for that matter. And that climate part of it dictated everything you did. So it was a lot different in the sheep days, because you needed, in the gestation period of a ewe and how you function in the lambing part of the cycle. And so you were completely confined to the better months of the year, the milder climate, to be able to shear and try and, let me put it this way. The rams went out at a very bad time of the year in a way, January, February, in our part of the Gascoyne. The coastal Gascoyne worked a slightly different and essentially a little bit more productive way of joining and landmarking and doing what they did. Better country, a lot better country. But our part of the central Gascoyne and East Gascoyne was certainly not near the carrying capacity than the coastal Gascoyne was. And even the climatics were slightly different from a temperature point of view, but it gets bloody hot everywhere. So every summer's a long summer in Western Australia. Some are just longer than others. But if essentially the climate provides you with a very wholesome summer for nearly 6 months of the year, you've got to do something when the weather's not pleasant for man or livestock. So rams would go out in sort of January, February, somewhere in that period. In that part of the Gascoyne, we shore in the winter, so that could be problematical with rivers and all sorts of things. So mustering started in sort of April-ish, around about there, and for a fairly big place like that, May, June, July was when you shore. And as you shore, you pull the rams out, so those sorts of things got done. And then later on in the year, you pull the stragglers out when you mark the lambs and in the sort of the spring. So that was sort of the, and then of course now it's spring, and then all of a sudden it's summer. It was a sort of a springy summer sort of a season, mostly summer. So by the end of September it's hot, or getting hot. And then of course that just goes on till March again, or April, or sometimes May. So that was unusual to be in May, but I can remember pulling all the beds out from under everyone on the lawn to get the shearers' beds back in the shearers' quarters. So we were still outside in May, back in that day. So look, that was essentially the cycle of sheep management, if you like, in the sheep days. So the rest of that summertime, it still does now, actually, is making sure that everything's getting a drink. Sheep were very hardy animals, but like cattle, they'll go a fair while and not have much to eat. And you can kid them along with licks and making sure they're in country that's not, that's been spilled, or whatever you do, whatever the management is that you do. But what they won't do is they won't go very long without a drink. So that then becomes your primary job, is to make sure everything gets a drink every day.
you're kept busy all year round.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's a period of, those 6 months of the cooler, nicer weather is where you kind of really go in hell for leather getting through
Absolutely.
all the majority of the stock work.
You do.
If that's the nice weather as well, I'm assuming or presuming that that's when all the social events are on as well.
Correct.
How did you guys, I guess, find a balance between trying to get through all the stock work, but also enjoying life and making sure you were, especially once you had kids as well, having a life outside of the animals and the property?
I'd like to answer that. I think that you just made that a priority, really. If there was something on, you definitely attended. Oh, look, if we were in the middle of a muster, maybe a really important muster or trucks were coming, but we made our business to make sure the kids had a good life socially as well, because they were very isolated really with other children. And so junction races, a Christmas tree, anything that was on we made sure that we attended.
Do you think having the kids was key to attending events? If perhaps before you had kids, or if you had not had kids, it would be a lot easier to go, oh no, we won't go to that. We'll keep mustering. We'll do this. We'll do that. Do you think the kids made you stop and actually go to things more?
Well, I think I probably was the one that took them to the occasions, and Locky probably stayed home. But we were fortunate. We were only 11 kilometres from Gascoyne Junction. And so a lot of the occasions were in Gascoyne Junction, so they were easy to get to. So maybe Locky didn't go to a lot of them.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Locky? I mean, how do you balance?
Slightly different, but I thought actually that we probably, when we were single, sort of a pretty worn-out looking esky and a swag was sort of, and half a dozen cartons of grog or a carton or whatever we drank. It was pretty easy.
So how did you approach, I guess, having, recreation time or time off from work when you had a family as well, or even before you had a family? Like, how did you find that balance, to go, we've only got 6 months, maybe less, maybe even, you don't know when summer's going to start again. We've got to get through this sheep work as fast as we can, but you also want to kind of stop and smell the roses along the way, because it's not as fun to do it all in summertime.
I don't think we ever sort of did that. The work always came first for me, and it did for most people, I think. If I had any regrets, we might have channeled that a little bit better. Kids up there today, or they're serious adults now, they do a lot better job of all that. They live in a little bit better economic environment, and they do a hell of a lot better job of their pastime and their leisure time and things in that way. And good luck to them, absolutely. And a lot of it's generated by their own endeavours. They do a lot better job of that part of parenting, and I'm absolutely convinced of that. I look at what our son does now with his children, and he's I'm embarrassed to think of how little I had to do with other than what was work. I mean, there was times and there was things, and I hope we've created enough opportunities for them. And I'm sure other people think and hope the same thing. I'm absolutely sure of that. But I don't think there'd be many people that wouldn't agree with me to think that what sort of a job that they're doing of running the country and rearing their families is something to be sort of really proud of, how they've done it, or how they're actually doing it. What did we set a good example? Well, maybe some of us have, and maybe some of us haven't. That's life, isn't it? Absolutely life. Whether you own a cattle station or a delicatessen, the principles by which you've done all that. Hopefully, if you're genuine about it all, and you're full time at what you're thinking. There's plenty of distractions today, of course, but you'd hope that rubs off.
So it sounds like you can see a bit of a difference in the work-life balance from your generation to the current generation.
Absolutely.
And that's not to say that they're working any less in this current generation, but it's just that allocation, that like intentional allocation of time to family.
Managed a lot better, in my view, and a better emphasis put on, everything. I was certainly brought up in an environment where everything was that job. And without that job or without that business, you didn't have a life. So that was sort of everything. And you sort of dragged everyone else along with you if you were single-minded enough. And I'm pretty sure I was one of those, and certainly was surrounded by people the same, and certainly a father that was the same. But that's a very, it's a pretty gratifying to see how a lot of young, the next generation down have succeeded. I mean, that's got a bit to do with what goes down a cow's neck and how much you get for it when you sell it. That's part of it all. But yeah, they've done really, I think they're doing really well.
In saying so, we did take 2 weeks off at New Year. We used to go to Coral Bay with the kids every year. We did that for years and years and years with other families. And our kids are still doing that today. That's been a great, happy childhood memory for all the kids. And as the girls got older, we had a fabulous governess there who was a serious rider, and we would go off to gymkhanas. There were a few around then, and the girls made a lot of friends and had a lot of fun on their horses. And every year, a great friend of mine, Joanne Simmons, and I started a riding school at Bidgemire. The kids were young then, very young. And that was held over the Easter period, and that unbelievably still goes till today, which the kids have. Every person that went to that riding school still talks about it. And so, and they were just as fun for the adults as it was for the kids. It was a really good social time for us all.
Talk to me about how important it was to have that riding school, and I'm guessing a lot of work went into it. And again, you're so busy with everything else you're doing. You're managing all these people. You've got kids. You've got visitors coming and going. The work's all, and that's the time of year where work's really starting to ramp up, the nicer weather. It'd just be so much easier to be like, well, no, we'll just wait and send them into town, or they can do something where they're at boarding school or whatever.
Not do it at all.
Yeah.
Look, we just made a focus. We just focused on it. Even though we're all very remote from each other, we all seem to manage to pull things together pretty well, I might tell you. We'd get instructors from Perth that had come up. Families would come from the Murchison, they'd come from the Pilbara with their kids, and it was a tradition. We would organise it right or wrong, and they would come right or wrong. It was something that they'd never miss. And I'm really pleased to see that the kids are still doing it today. They've moved into camp drafting now, but this is where all our kids' friends all learned really initially at the Bidgemire Riding School. It was a really great thing to have. And kids are all on School of the Air. So they all got to meet their peers in the school that they only saw twice a year. And, they all remain terrific friends today.
I imagine that there would have been many challenges that came with living out where you did. We've touched on some of them already, the no 24-hour power, unsealed roads, lack of communication, isolation. Can you tell me about some of your experiences back in those days and how you handled them? And I suppose particularly for you as well, Jane, like it would have been quite different having to deal with something when you're so remote versus, and Denny's still a rural town, but you're a lot closer to help when you need it, whether it's a plumber or an ambulance.
Well, you had to think on your feet a fair bit. We had a medical chest, RFDS big medical chest, and we did have the pedal radio if required, and we did have the telephone during the day. So we did have access to doctors, and we would have to use that medical chest as required. And often, it was for, you might have a break, you got a broken foot or arm, or, you would be advised over the phone how to deal with it. So you became a nurse quite a bit. It's just that and if it was serious, the RFDS was around, but you had to sort of deal with the trauma, which you did do. Common sense a lot of the time, but it's a bit nerve-wracking at times.
In all those situations, you're dealing with, I suppose in a way, a roundabout way, it's like a captain of a ship. You're dealing with situations that you have to deal with: sudden deaths, injury from work accidents, or and just as much as we were pretty lucky that way. Even road accidents, we were on, public roads went everywhere, and they were haphazard enough, and there was sort of, road accidents happened and people were killed and or badly injured, and you needed to deal with those sorts of things. And on occasions there was a couple of literally old age deaths, deaths for natural causes, and well, you had to deal with it. And I don't think that's changed from today, Steph. I don't think so. I think that presents itself today as a trauma just as much as it did then. It might be a little bit easier to deal with, or the road was better to travel down to get there, or whatever it was. And but there was a few staff deaths, a couple by just natural causes, and they were pretty confronting. Finding someone dead, and that happened 3 or 4 times that I can remember. But essentially, it's a trauma one way or not. Or the other thing that I always hated and did that several times, not many times, but it was an infrequent thing, thank goodness, was telling members of the staff that a loved one had died elsewhere, killed in an accident, or natural causes, or it was grandma, but the son and daughter thing, I did that 2 or 3 times. So what do? You do it. We just had to deal with what we had in front. No one we always rang the policeman, but if we could get hold of a policeman, or whatever the deal was that you needed to do lawfully, but you had to do something about it now. And that's not just the blood, dripping off someone's forehead. That's someone who is deceased or is gravely ill. So some of them are a terrible trauma and a great shock if it's been a pretty ordinary accident. And some of them are, older people that perhaps if they were living in a suburb in Perth may well have survived, but they were older people who had a heart attack or, usually something, heart failure or something like that. And you dealt with them as a deceased person.
How did the two of you cope with that yourselves, though, after the fact? I mean, you're in charge, in a position of responsibility, and like you said, you have to do what's lawful, so notify police, wait for somebody to come and collect a body. But then how did you guys, I guess, process that? Because not to make huge assumptions, but we're talking about back in the days where I'm guessing there might not have been a lot of processing. It certainly wasn't commonplace to speak about it and bring out, now if somebody, passes away on a station, staff are offered counselling. There's all sorts of services and support, but I think we're talking about a time where that wasn't commonplace.
We counselled ourselves. We had a community there. We really had a community on the station. So we counselled ourselves, a lot of discussion, talked it definitely through, how we could have done it better, or, I think we counselled ourselves actually. And would you put it that way, Locky?
Yeah, I'm a bit more forthright about what I think about these things. I mean, you might be saying you counsel, as a community, you might be counselling it, but sort of really, and it's part of that resilience that we're talking about, the goods and the bads, and particularly the bads, bad droughts, all the dilemmas that go on with an industry that might have failed, cattle prices or wool prices or whatever it was, is that that resilience is borne out in things like this is you just get on with it. You just have, in most of the circumstances that I found myself was that you had no other opportunity than to get on with what had to be done. And I've always thought that that's probably as good a therapy for a lot of people that are in a situation, something like that. And of what I've, without sounding too hard on people, is that there seems to be a lot of opportunity to dwell on things. And I haven't seen a lot of good come from that process of going through and dwelling on some of the bad things that might have happened to you or to someone else. I just haven't, in my life experience, I have seen people recover, obviously, but the endless sort of talking through a traumatic experience doesn't seem to be any better than just bloody well getting on with what you got to do. And of all the things that we've been through, we just didn't have time. We literally didn't have time. You might in the middle of the night think, oh, this isn't going any well. Or, there's things you might dwell on, but only almost momentarily. You get on with, you've had to get on. That's a better way of putting it. You have to get on with just doing it. Getting it right, maybe you might do something a bit differently. Do you regret anything? Well, you haven't had much of a life if you haven't regretted anything, have you? So yeah, I of all those, there's been lots of accidents in the air. You dwell on a bit of that. The next morning, Steph, on the next day, the next time you muster out, especially if someone's died not far away, the turns are very shallow. You're up another 500 feet and there's a bit of that going on. And because you've had to get on with what you're doing. Is it unsafe? It's as unsafe sometimes as you make it. Anyway, that's enough of that.
A sense of humour was required as well, and there was plenty of that. And not in a death or anything, but, there was always, there were pretty good people we had around us, and we could always find something funny in something, and I think that's sort of how you get by too, with a bit of, not fun's the wrong word, but there was some pretty funny times with some accidents and things, and,
it's black humour, isn't it?
Yeah, black humour, I think, is what we've all got a bit of, and there was always a funny side to something that we could cackle away at. There's plenty of accidents, all right.
So there's challenging times in the sense of, accidents and deaths and things that haven't gone to plan in that sense in I guess, short periods of time. But I'd like to ask you now about something that would have been a challenging time stretched out over many years. And that's, I guess, the end of the sheep days and transitioning to cattle, something that wasn't necessarily, not really anybody's first choice to do. It was something that you kind of had to adapt to.
Yeah, well, the transition was, of course, that we just went out the back door, and we lived in that part of our life. We lived on the fringe of animal husbandry, basically. So whatever changes came in climate or wool prices or sheep price or whatever, they're felt out on the fringes first. And for longer, normally. That's just a fact. That's just a fact, an economic fact. So when that transition came from sheep to cattle, that was a real tooth-pulling exercise, that. And I was still working for a family that weren't very happy about that. In fact, we bought the place 12 months before it all collapsed, 18 months before the wool price thing collapsed. So we'd bought a property that hadn't been paid for by a long shot. And, what do we always say? It seemed like a good idea at the time. There was a fair bit of that. It sounded like a pretty lousy idea, but So when we made that transition, we made it, the family business company didn't own the place then, we did. And we burnt the candle at both ends a bit. We had most of the sheep there, and when we started to increase the cattle numbers, and we sort of scrambled and sold our way out of the sheep and introduced the cattle. And it was very busy. And there was lots of people doing the same thing. I don't know whether it would have made any difference to the decisions we made, but there was plenty of warning signs. And I mean, wool was an institution, you know. Australia was built on the back of a sheep, and all the sheep's back and all that sort of thing went on. And remember, you know, when wool was a pound in the 50s, there was a fair bit used to get recited amongst our superiors and when I made the decision, well, we made the decision, I suppose I made it really, but was that we were going to get out of, we just had to get out of wool. We'd gone out the back door, basically. And there was a lot of government and industry interference in things like the reserve price scheme, and eventually there was a very hapless, you know, federal minister decided that the floor price scheme wasn't working, which it hadn't been for a long time, and they dropped that literally with a couple of million bales in the wool stockpile. I mean, if you look back over what happened then, there'd be people that wouldn't believe what happened. We were paying 22% wool tax. The interest rates were sort of around the 20%. I mean, they were pretty good places to put up with all that. It was a pretty dark time, really. But we were that busy trying to survive that it didn't impact on us the way that it might today if you had time to think about what was going on. The information we had was pretty scant. We certainly probably weren't listening to a lot of it because we were too busy trying to do what we were doing. Well, that's probably not completely true, but I just remember thinking, never thinking that I'd changed my mind about anything other than that I knew that despite what my family elders were saying, and it was our business, it was Jane and my business, is that we were getting a lot of advice about what we should be doing, and my father was very upset that I was going to sell all the sheep on Bidgemire and fill it up with cattle. He was just beside himself. I think we might have had one of the little sessions of no speakies there for a few months while I ruined a perfectly good business. And
how long after the collapse of the wool market did you decide to sell the sheep and to move to cattle? Like, was it within a couple of weeks, or was it a couple of months?
Well, the first shearing after that all went bung, and we'd shot 6,000 ewes in the flock reduction scheme. That was all part of this bright idea with the AWC had put together with the luminaries at the head of the industry. We decided that it wasn't very good marbles, any of this, and of course our financiers didn't think it was either. So the only way that we could continue was to borrow some more money and buy cattle and that's literally what happened.
And I guess what sheep you did sell, they wouldn't have been worth much.
No, they weren't. It wasn't too bad. It wasn't too bad until we got to the end. You know, good sheep that were in good order. There were still people buying good younger sheep. But the last sheep that were actually sold, were from Lions River, the top homestead. There was the last of those sheep that were sold up there, which of the whole flock of the three wool sheds, they were sold for $3 in the wool on the place. So that's not far off giving them away. So the bloke who bought those sheep paid for the freight, and he got a sheep that was in the wool for $3. And that was, I suppose that would have been about 20%, 15 to 20% of the total flock. But the year before that, where we were selling, they sold pretty well. Yeah, certainly enough to sort of shore up the already bludgeoning debt, and then of course start paying for the money that we'd bought and loaned to buy cattle. So it was a pretty bloody ordinary time of our lives. But in any event, we got into the 90s and we had a couple of really pretty reasonable seasons, and the cattle numbers just exploded, which they do. If you give them a drink and they get a feed, and they just exploded, literally exploded, and away we went.
I have to ask you though about this ewe reduction scheme. So is that where you were being paid a price to shoot your animals? Like, were they compensating you for that?
I think there was some sort of compensation. Of all the things that I never liked, if I found anything that was other than maybe the flood and a few people that, there was people that died and any other thing that went on that was very unpleasant. The traumatic part of some of the things we did was shooting sheep. And, I went through it as a young bloke in South Australia. We shot 3,500 ewes heavy in lamb because they were too dumb to have sold them the year before. That's one of the big lessons in anything is doesn't matter what you're selling, you meet the market. Mm. And, they kept a big heap of sheep that should have been sold. They knocked back about $5 a head for them or something pathetic. And, of course, all these sheep were all joined again and all had a lamb and or tried to have a lamb. And, of course, now they're worth, well, I know we sent, there was about 120 a deck. So there's 3 decks on those and struck those, there's 360. And they went off to Peterborough and, the old bookkeeper at Nonning walked out the door and said, well, we're not going to, it's very good here, Mr. McTaggart. This is my uncle. They said, what have we got there, Dennis? And he said, well, we've got $12.50, sir. He said, my goodness, that's good money. He said, no, that's for the truckload. So they got 5 cents a sheep or 6 cents a sheep for the sheep. And after that, he thought it was a good idea that we shoot the rest of the sale sheep that needed to be done away with. So that's when Torgy Paulson and I and a bloody old Fordson tractor, we just murdered these sheep for bloody days and days.
And then you had to relive that on July with those 6,000. That's what I wonder. I
had people that I could blame for that. There was people that were clearly responsible for that.
How did you cope with, that would have taken days, if not longer, to put all those sheep down?
Yeah, they were shot in 3 mobs at the 3 shearing sheds. Yeah, we had a tip truck and, that old international tip truck. And only trouble was every so often someone would, it'd be a ricochet, and someone would bloody end up with a bit of skin missing off their shin or something with a bloody little 22, hollow-nosed 22s. And, yeah, that wasn't something that I actually did. I didn't actually pull the trigger. I shot a few because I had to. But I'd been through it all before and there was other people tasked with that particular job. Having done it before, I didn't feel as though I was shirking a responsibility, but I was able to avoid it. It's a better way of putting it. Maybe I was shirking a responsibility coming to think of it now, but I didn't actually shoot any of them other than a 20 or 30 one day I had to. But yeah, perfectly good sheep.
So take me back to this time where you're getting out of sheep, you're getting into cattle. Sheep are, you're not making, the wool market's crashed. You've got this debt, you've got this high interest. It's just it sounds like a financial fiasco to, and not of your doing, but just to be a part of, because it's not just as simple as saying, okay, the sheep aren't worth anything. We're going to sell them. We're not going to make much. We'll buy cattle. And that's it. You've got to change everything to make the property suitable for cattle. You've got to make a lot and that infrastructure requires a lot of capital that you don't have.
That was a bigger task, and it was done over a fair period of time, but certainly utterly constrained by finance. And then there was a couple of government schemes that encouraged us into certain practices, that building trap yards and things like that we took full advantage of, and built a lot of the backyards for trap yards. But that was done over a fair period of time. But one of the problems was, it wasn't a bad problem to have, was that the cattle numbers were increasing a hell of a lot quicker than we could sort of put facilities in place to be able to do it efficiently. So it was it was a pretty ragged old show for a fair while. And then, we've done what we've done.
So in that time, my memory has just come back. We went into tourism.
Oh, yeah, we did.
Because things were pretty tight. And I think there was a government scheme. If we went dollar for dollar to improve a facility we had, which we call the lodge. So we improved the lodge infrastructure and I took on tourists. And of course, the shearers' quarters became redundant. And we spent a bit of money tidying them up. And I took in tourists. It's a little memory that I'd like to block from my brain because that just added to the workload. It was
added to the income.
It added to the income, but it was a circus. But what it did do was it did bring in a little bit of income and not a huge amount, but the workload there was absolutely massive and it became popular. The Junction Hotel, Gascoyne Junction Hotel, was operating, but it didn't really have accommodation there. And so there was no other accommodation at Gascoyne Junction. So people would come and stay with us. That included meals and the pipeline, I think, might have been going through the Bunbury to Burrup to Bunbury pipeline was going through. So we had a lot of their hierarchy stay with us. And really that was probably quite good for our income at the time, but by the living, we had to do a bit of work there. And took a lot of your time away at night time because you had to entertain them at night.
Did the place good.
It got the infrastructure going around the place, really. You had to keep the four corners absolutely perfect.
All the bins were painted and, the place kept clean all the time. There was no big jihad on keeping the place clean every month or anything. It went on all the time.
Yeah.
It's good.
It sounds like you just, you did what you had to do.
Yeah.
For the bigger picture.
And I was pleased when that was over. That was just enormous.
I did have a bloke who came flying a helicopter and I remember this bloke saying to me one night in this camp, he said, I've heard about this place all my life. He's a fellow from McTaggart and I've heard about this place all my life. He said, I reckon when you get this going, it'll be a pretty handy cattle station. And he said, but how you people ever run sheep here, I'll never know. Because of the river systems, There were 16 sheep fence crossings across the river and a big long place that took up the Gascoyne and it was a handful. We ran Bidgemar as a sheep station with a great deal of difficulty. Big staff, it was a lot of fencing. So that all changed. That part of the economics changed a lot when we went to cattle. That breathed life into the whole thing, much to the chagrin of my father. He thought it was a big mistake. But, and of course it made a huge difference to the country. There was a fellow back who was a great friend of my father's and, he was and of a lot of people there. And he was one of the old, luminaries and, doyen in the agriculture, in the ag department. Fellow called Dr. Hank Sudendorf. And he was a great instigator of buffel and things like that. And he always had a saying. He used to say the difference between sheep and cattle in the pastoral industries is that cattle have the decency to die in a drought. And it's sort of true. Like once we got rid of the sheep, it gave the country a big boost. Because the cattle, you don't need as many of them for a start. And they're cloven-foot animals, but they don't have nearly the impact that the sheep did. if managed properly. Of course, that goes without saying in both instances, but they're not windbound in paddocks. All the south east and southwest end of all the old sheep paddocks were eaten out because that's where they were windbound with prevailing winds, and they were waterbound basically as well. Cattle are to a certain extent as well, but they're certainly not windbound at all. They prune, they graze in a lot more effective, sustainable way is a better way of putting that. Yeah.
Had you had much to do with cattle before the transition?
A bit. Yes, I had. I think I should just say yes. I worked on places in New South Wales and for a little while in the territory that had cattle on them. They were sort of the New South Wales things was a couple of years, but the 18 months, but the Queensland thing, the Territory Queensland thing was, basically part of a moving holiday. But yeah, I had in pastoral settings as well. So, but I had a lot to learn. Don't worry.
That's what I was wondering.
But I knew I had a lot to learn.
Okay. Because you've gone from being, a very experienced sheep man to now you're running cattle. Did you, I'm guessing, like you said, you had a lot to learn. How did you take that? So you've acknowledged that. Was it hard to ask people for help and for advice?
Oh, no, that's never ever worried me, no. No, there was a lot of, I think the adage, whether it's totally true or not, there's two types of failures. There's those who listen to everyone and those who listen to no one. And I always hope and the other important thing, of course, is tongue in cheek, is it's really important you get good advice. So as opposed to bad advice, but I think I'd sort of picked my way through the people that I thought that I should listen to, and I did listen to them. And there's a lot of things that they might have said that I didn't like much, or about my own attitude or my own behaviour when it came to a certain way of doing things. And that wasn't all just cattle. That was some financial advice as well. Stop whinging about, capital gains or whatever it was, or, whatever it was we had to deal with at the time and get on with it. Someone's got to put these cattle in the yard. Let your accountant worry about, capital gains or whatever we were worrying about at the time. GST was another one. What is GST? He said, well, just pay someone to fix that for you. Is he going to put these cattle in the yard for you? Oh, well, that's your job. Shut up and stop whinging, sort of. There was a bit of that sort of advice. Sometimes you don't take advice unless you get it in a very stern or unpleasant way, downright nasty sometimes. Maybe you don't listen as well as we think we do sometimes. I think most people, if you have a really good season, there's a lot of people can do that well. It's how you handle things when things are really tough is what matters. And, there's certain criteria you might follow to do that. And so I suppose I went to the penny dropped with things like bulls. I went with a great fellow, knows more about Queensland than the Queenslanders do really, and he'd been going there for 30 years before I had anything to do with him. And we went over there and he put me on the right track, and that was following advice and practical advice, and went and looked and did all the things it's very hard to learn these sorts of things if you're not, if you haven't been brought up to the anatomy of, looking at good cattle and good bulls and whatever is, it's very hard to learn the sale yard. You learn that going on at properties and looking at bulls and blokes pointing things out and whatever. So those sort of people whose advice I followed, I certainly emulated a lot of the things how they ran their own places. And a little bit of mix of it all. Did I get it better, do it better than they did? Most certainly not. But I didn't dream up a lot of these things myself. I saw someone doing something and thought, gee, I'm going to do that. Like, I'll see if I can make that work.
As time went on, The McTaggarts settled into life running a cattle station. The conversion was an expensive, long process, and there were a few challenges along the way, but they took it in their stride. And while some things on the station had changed, one thing hadn't: their reliance on rainfall. And not just any rainfall, but the right amount at the right time of year. 2008, 9 and 10 saw one of the worst droughts in the history of Bidjamaya. So when it started raining a week before Christmas in 2010, the family thought Christmas had come early. However, their excitement was soon short-lived.
At that time of the year, any rain you get in that part of the Gascoyne anyway, or in that Gascoyne region, any rain you get before Christmas in thunderstorms and things are a big bonus. Any river flow you can get before Christmas is a big bonus. So that just shortened up the summer a little bit for you. It might get, you've got January and February to come, but so we ended up overnight with a couple of 50 mils of rain. And we hadn't had 50 mils of rain for a couple of years, basically. In one hit, we'd put together, one year we only had 50 mils of rain, or 60 mils of rain. So we'd got into the third year with very, very little rain. I mean, there's longer droughts than 3 years in Australia, Who wants to be in a competition to see how long your drought was? But they were particularly dry years, very savage years. We got to the end of, we got to the 16th or 17th of December, and, this extraordinary rainfall, event started. And over the period of an afternoon and an early evening, we received basically for the day, 50 mils of rain, like proper rain, beautiful rain. And we thought, well, we've beaten this. We've there you go. We've been able to, the management strategy we had is succeeded here. We've spent a lot of money doing what we're doing. And there'd been a wedding 3 months before, and there was 2 or 3 bottles of champagne left in the chiller, left over from the festivities. So we knocked them off. And how good's this? How clever are we? You're like, this is easy. And it sort of rained during the night, kept raining, and good, steady, down, tropical rain. And it was still raining the next morning. And then it started to rain, like it was torrential rain. And it kept that up all day. And it did that all night. And about in the late afternoon, things were starting to think, well, okie dokie, this has been a blast, but that'll do for now. Thank you very much. Got to be careful what you wish for, Steph. And I got in an aeroplane, and the airstrip at Bidjamaya used to fill up in the middle. It's, for over many years of use, it was a sort of a spoon affair. But in a Piper Cub, you could always get somewhere in a Piper Cub. And you could take off along the edge on the sandy part and the buffle on the side. Not a pleasant experience. And I flew to Weed Arrow, which is, 30 minutes flying straight east, to just see what had gone on with the couple that lived there. They were on their own there and feeding cattle up there. And I found them. Essentially I found them alive. That was the main thing. And when I got back to Bidjamaya, I could only land on what was left on the side and the strip of the strip. And the plane actually stayed there. It never ended up back in the shed. And it stayed there and went underwater where it was on the bank, where we never ever thought water could ever get to. So that was the start of this. And the next day we had a record flood. I mean, it was 2 meters above any other record that known in European history. So that was the start of the flood. So that night, the next night, is when we ended up on the tanks overnight, and the water got to wherever, we just, for me, I didn't stop functioning, but it was a bit of a break in the system, if you like. That was when, from then on, even the evening before, Hamish was driving this thing along. There was Jody and myself and Jane and 4 dogs were the passengers at that stage. Maybe I mightn't have been such a cut case by then, but at that stage. But so that's when he started being the manager.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, probably we didn't need a flood to make that happen, but it probably sped it up a bit. So. The girls fed 1,000-odd calves over the space of that drought at the woolshed because we were dragging these calves off their mothers all the time. And on the day, we had about 280, wasn't quite 300 when the flood came along. So we drove those cattle through and got them up to where we were. The cottage where Hamish and Jody lived and the roof and the tanks we ended up on was the last surviving highest bit of ground within the homestead complex. By that stage, by the late afternoon, water was waist deep in the house. So, in fact, I went down there in the late afternoon and it was up to my chest, lower chest, belly button stuff in the house then. So we'd driven these cattle up onto the last bit of high ground, and as that started to shrink, we knew there was a bit of higher ground further away, so we literally drove these cattle off into the water and away up now it's getting pretty down. Now spirits are pretty low, and the girls are on the roof with the dogs, and back come about a dozen of these little calves of various sizes. And of course, they got gutters on by Afrins. That's what happens, in that droughty situation. They're just getting enough to survive, really, with bottles and milk nuts and Christ knows what. So they sort of half bobbed their way back, and Hamish said, now we're in knee-deep water at the house that could never go underwater. That's where we are up at this cottage, not far off the sun disappearing. And he said, well, what do we do here? We're going to dong them. We can't bloody dong them on the head. I said, look, girls are on the roof and things aren't going too well up there. There's a few tears. We've hit the wall here now. So I said, look, we'll put them in the house. So we mustered this dozen head of calves. We stuck them in the house and shut the door. So they're in the house. We get on the tanks. The roofs are bloody hopeless. You don't want to have to camp on a roof all night, I can tell you. So we got down on the flat surfaces on these 2 rainwater tanks. So it was flat, thank goodness. Otherwise, you're stuck on a gutter. If there's a gutter, you're pretty right. But you're hard, unless you get right on the eave, you're buggered. It's a big job staying on a roof all night. I sympathise with anyone who's had to do it. And of course, dogs. So anyway, we're on this. We've got a tank each, the newlyweds and their 2 dogs. They have 2 or 1, Jane?
2, and
2.
we had 3.
Oh, is that? They had 1. Yeah, that's right. So, righto. So we ended that day with us on our tank and our dogs and those on, and of course it's raining. So the next morning, we watched this thing and it got to where I never ever, just couldn't believe where the water had got to. And the horses were not far away. And of course they had to keep moving because the water runs around their feet and they lose their footing. So that they just can't stand in one spot because the water was running pretty swiftly. So the next morning, the rivers, about 1 o'clock in the morning, it started to drop, and the Gascoyne runs very quickly. There's a lot of fall in the Gascoyne, and it stopped. When it stopped, and then it only peaks for about an hour, and then it started to go down again. And it always usually falls a lot faster than it does rise. So by morning, it's sort of ankle deep or better. It's just covered. And when we get down and we start looking, and so in the house, there was about 4 or 5 survived. The rest were just tangled up in the furniture and drowned. But what you don't realise with a house that fills up with water is that most things invert. That table there certainly would invert. This one mightn't, but the heavy part of this table's the top. So when it gets floating a bit, it just tips upside down. So there's this, it just looks like there's a bomb going off in this house. Things float and some don't, and like it's just, and of course there's mud everywhere and dead calves. So on the walls, there's these grease marks on the walls. What the bloody hell they are? Because some survived. And what it was, the water had got too deep for them, and they were sort of half either standing on something or tiptoeing, and they kept their noses out of the water and their chins were rubbing on the floor. That's what these, because we were, what the bloody hell's that? Like, anyway, that's an aside. But so that was all pretty bleak. Bloody dead cattle everywhere. Christ, like. And of course, the cattle we were
screaming all night.
The cattle that in the up at the yards, we drowned most of them. So anyway, that's so eventually with dead kangaroos and dead cattle, we eventually got a loader out, borrowed a loader from some absolutely marvellous people who lent us a lot of gear. They lent us, he lent us a loader, and I spent a bloody long time burying cattle to stop the smell. It did work too, because it was starting to give us the shits of the house, this stink. So there's all these bloody mounds around for a long time. No,
still there today, those mounds. It reminds me every time I go down the drive.
There was dead cattle, and even the cattle that we had, we couldn't, the ones that we dragged out, we successively got them further and further away, but of course the ground had been flooded. It was bloody, and it was in the house for a couple of days, the main house for a couple of days after that. So anyway, there's lots of stories like that. There's lots of people. But of all the things that happened from my point of view, the one thing, we were evacuated from that area. We went and lived in Gascoyne Junction for a couple of days, and always think of Hamish and Jody. They were back out there living in that, what was just a complete wreck. Within a couple of days, they moved back out there. And Jane and I lived in a house at the Shire, an old house at the Shire for, must have been a fortnight or more before we moved back out. I had the nerve to go back out there, but they were there within a couple of days. No power, no nothing, just out in the bloody, there was no lawns, unbelievable.
The heat was excruciating.
But yeah, the dead cattle, and cattle and bloody way up in trees, and you just wonder how, oh my God, they ended up floating up there, but they did, they were there. But anyway. So the people at Weedara, the one thing from that was at exactly the same time as that big flood in the Locky Valley, out from Brisbane.
Mm-hmm.
Now there was, I think the death toll there was 12, and I think there was 2 or 3 or 4 of those people were never found. And the one good thing, you can say, you take a positive out of all this, was we lost a lot of cattle and our lives went down the river that couple of days, but no one drowned, no person drowned, which is significant when it's coming to sort of getting over these things and getting on with your life. Now I was 60, I think, when that happened. So we went through it all in our 30s, no money, no nothing. And
back to square one.
And at 60, it was a bit bigger job, a bit trickier. Same thing financially, margin calls and bloody foreclosure threats and all sorts of bloody things went on in that next year, like. And the people, Steph, who lent us washing machines and lighting plants and utes and Darcy's lent us a perfectly good Toyota ute that we used, and that was Sean and Tim lent us Chucky Della bloody lighting plants and washing machines, and Kemptons did the same thing. They lent us a ute there for a couple of weeks and they didn't have anything else to drive, so we had it for a week and then got it back to them, sort of thing, very great people. You know. Lord Mayor's Appeal Fund, that was a thing that, helped a lot. Well, it made it possible to sort of survive all that. So
You spoke earlier in this episode about how when you're out on a station and something happens, like the buck stops with you, like you can't wait for the cavalry to come. You have to deal with it, whether it's an accident, a death, or say a flood. Like there was no one that was going to come and start moving these dead cattle or picking up all the debris inside the homestead complex and within the houses. That fell down to you guys to do.
Had a lot of help. Yeah, but you're right. But we did eventually
get there. The thing is, all the roads
we
are
were getting
gone.
there.
Water was still in the creeks. No one could actually get to us for probably
helicopters was
only a helicopter.
But we had a bloke who did, help us with helicopter and actually came and rescued us. In actual fact, we organised our own rescue, as it turned out. You sometimes wonder about these things. There was police helicopters and SES machines in there. They're that big they bloody near blotted out the sun every time they took off in Gascoyne Junction. And they were really of no help at all. They did a bit. There was a few news opportunities in the town. I sound pretty cynical about this, and I remain so. But most people you'll find that you'll talk to and you rub shoulders with are very hard to help. They are very hard to help because we're used to having to help ourselves. There is lots of people that do and should benefit from our help, SES and the like. But people in the bush don't rate amongst them. We're hard to help. Most of the help that we were offered was too late, and we didn't want another wardrobe. But that's what happens, in that situation. It was pretty tricky stuff for a while. But at the end of the day, the real outcome, the lasting outcome is the financial outcome.
I was just about to ask you, at what point do you have an idea of the damage financially and what that's done to your business?
Well, that took a while to unfold. Some of it was very quick, but it's that business about making sure you get good advice. I think we've always had pretty good advice, and I hope so anyway. And part of that kicked in with what was required to sort of pacify banks and do things was done by people who do that professionally. And one of them was a long-lasting friend, and will remain so. So he was the bloke who wears a suit to work every day, and he went off and tackled some financiers in Melbourne for us, from Adelaide, where he lives in Adelaide, and he did that for us. But we were technically snookered. We will, what piece of this does a finance company want, or the financial institution want? And he managed to sort of bash them all back. It was our problem, but he's one of those folks with a happy knack of turning it into their problem, not ours. And from that point on, we were able to, and much to the credit of people like Jane and Jody, from there on was that we had these, the lesson we learnt from that from a finance point of view is don't stop talking to the bank. Talk to them more, and she religiously every month, every week, I think at one stage was making a financial report as to what's been spent and what hasn't been spent and what comes next. And we learnt from this bloke the valuable lesson that the people that are running these banks are people as well. They are human beings. So that discipline, I think they probably still do something similar today.
Did insurance help at all?
Yes, it did. The insurance from a flood point of view is a pretty sad one, as you probably know, apart from Suncorp in places like southern Queensland, rising water is flood water and you're not insured. So we got some inundation insurance, but all the vehicles were covered by comprehensive insurance. Most of them were anyway. And certainly anything we owed money on has to be insured. And aircraft insurance has always been pretty good. And, of course, that insurance money we lived on, what we were able to glean out of that, we sort of had 12 months of trying to restore what we were doing. And we did that in a large way with insurance money. Well, of course, we didn't have the money. We got sort of X amount of money for a vehicle that was insured, but that didn't buy the next vehicle because we were spending it on something else, tucker, So there was a bit of catch-up went on there. And then the cattle prices came good after that. We didn't sell many cattle that year, I'll tell you, but it's a pretty strange old muster. But I think we ended up with enough. We certainly had enough cattle survived on adjustment, and there were very, very few on the station other than there was a lot of dry cattle. We found a lot of big bullocks and things. So we didn't pay our bills. But, the year after that, away we went and, we didn't buy any cattle. We started again.
It would be an incredibly difficult situation to be in at any stage of life. But as you said, you were in your early 60s and you're probably looking down the barrel of retirement. It's maybe not next year or anything, but it's on the horizon. You're probably, you're just thinking, I've just worked my butt off for the last 40 years building this place up, keeping it going, having the opportunity to take it over and get it to where it is. And then as you said, you see it all wash down the river. And
that was probably the most confronting thing, sort of 6 months later sort of thing, realising that we were, it happened on the day. You're sort of fairly pacified. You're incapable of sort of really taking it all in. That's why Hamish was so important. He was sort of getting on with and then we had lots of friends. We had Blaze Aid come later on. Lots of friends helped and Blaze Aid was probably, and I know a neighbour he utilised the use of the army. There wasn't that many stations that were really seriously affected. It was just that part of the Gascoyne and the town got a bit of Carnarvon got a bit of a touch-up. A good touch-up. I shouldn't make a flippant remark about that. There was a fair bit of bother in there. But, yeah, the financial, like I said earlier, the final outcome is the financial problem. And that was a problem for a while. Yeah, that was a bit of an issue. And how we were ever going to get around it. So, here we are.
Were you impacted much by, the following year we had the live export ban? And while that was the northern market?
No, it didn't affect us at all, really. We didn't have any cattle for sale.
If you had cattle for sale, would it have affected you?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But you see, we'd drowned everything the year before. We hadn't drowned them. They were only little fault, there wasn't enough. There wasn't enough to impact us. There just wasn't. We just weren't back in business. It most certainly would.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, really. I don't know how to look at that.
No, well, if you're trying to find a positive, you've got to have a pretty good pick through that, don't you, to find one?
Yeah.
Oh, it was very significant. Clearly, it was very significant for anyone in the north, and particularly right across the top. Yeah, certainly the Kimberley and the Territory and the northern end of Queensland, very significant outcomes. But not such a big thing for us.
Okay.
At the time.
Yeah.
They were all cattle to sell them.
Speaking of the financial impact of the flood, it was only a few years later that you were seriously considering selling Bidgemire. Can you talk me through that?
I just can't remember the actual details, and this might sound a bit strange, of why we arrived at that situation, other than that we'd sort of reckoned that we'd had enough. And one of the financial outcomes to stop a little bit of the trouble would have been to sell. And cattle were worth a lot of money. The market was on the up. We'd had a pretty reasonable season. So that's when you contemplate these things. And that went on for a couple of years. And in the end, Hamish and Jody expressed an interest to be part of that, to buy it. There was always going to be a family arrangement if we sold the place. And I think they even looked at moving to Queensland and get into some cattle and get over there. And there's plenty of cattle there. And that was one of those passing things that went on, and who could afford what with what we might be able to sell the property for. And then in the end, when they expressed the only challenge then was, and it was peripheral, but it is a real thing, is that then we needed to be able to, we had to work out whether we could afford to let them buy it at a reasonable family rate. And that sort of included the value of the cattle and the plant and the things that we subsequently made a deal with them to buy the place. And that, of course, has been, from Jane and my point of view, and I hope from their point of view, the best possible outcome we could have had. I'm sure it is. I hope it is for them as well.
How much would you say the flood had to do with that feeling of, like, we've had enough now?
A lot, Jane, I think.
It was on the cards. It was definitely on the cards anyway. I think it was probably definitely, certainly in my case, I was over it. You know, 38 years of work went into that place, and it went down the river in 24 hours, and I was just don't think I had the energy to start again. So I was quite keen to go. There's no doubt about that.
You know, from what you're saying, is a perfectly natural reaction, but we reckon that after all that, no one drowned, and we actually started to think that we were pretty bloody lucky, actually. Not lucky that the place had gone underwater, and, you know, I think, well, there's no doubt about it, we'd have been a lot better financially off if that hadn't have happened. And we did leave that part of the world with a few dogs tied up, and still have. I'm not embarrassed by that at all, but yeah, all these things happen for a reason, I suppose you could say, if you want to be circumspect about it. But I know that had a profound effect on what we all ended up doing. Are we sort of glad it happened? No, we're not. But it sort of probably accelerated a lot of things that turned out to be the right thing to do anyway.
And I think, in hindsight, when I think about it now, it was the beginning of summer. The heat was excruciating. I think we might have hit the 50 degrees, 47, and it was relentless, and we had no power, and it was just so hard to do anything. You know, you were just, it was sheer exhaustion, really, to try and recover from just in the next few weeks. And that was the beginning of summer. So it was pretty hard work.
So
yeah, it was hard, all right.
You weren't, I mean, this reminds me of the beginning of the episode. You weren't a young bride that was, you know, able to withstand the heat and the lack of electricity and all the mod cons that you didn't have, because, as you said back then, being young had a lot to do with it.
Yeah, yes.
You also just hadn't seen your whole life washed down the river back then either.
But that was, I think the heat was the thing that really knocked us around more than anything. And then, not that I'm complaining, but we were still having to feed people. You know, you still have to, we had a lot of people that came to help us, and it was a muddly 3 months, really, and everything was a disaster. Whenever anyone went and found anything or retrieved anything from the river, or and went out to a windmill, if they could get out there, the windmill was over and the solar panels were down, and there were more dead cattle and the yards had gone down. Everything was a bad story for quite a while afterwards, really. So it wasn't much fun. But in hindsight, I put it down to as an experience, really. And there's nothing more really you can say about it. It's just an experience. I don't want to go through it again. We live on a hill now.
As we came to the end of our conversation, I asked Locky and Jane to reflect on their time at Bidjimaya and share what they've taken away from it.
Lesson. It's a bit hard to sort of point to one thing that you learnt, Steph, but I suppose the first thing I'd say is Jane ought to go first.
Maybe resilience is a good word, but we haven't really touched on the fantastic times we've had there. And I think they're definitely my memories. We had some, we lived in an extraordinary world, really. Junction races, the social outings that we had, the amazingly funny people that we had as friends, have as friends. And maybe we're all very like-minded people that live up there, and we had a lot of really good, fun times as well. So it's not all sad. I think probably resilience is a good word, maybe. My kids were very resilient and are still today. I'm proud of them. And our girls really played an important role. We haven't talked about them much, but they were seriously affected by that flood, and they came, up for a good month. They lost every single thing they owned. And, I think they played a really big role in all of that. I'll be forever grateful for that. But we had plenty of good times, don't worry. The riding schools, all the things we did up there was great fun.
It's a big life, it is a big life. It's
yeah.
Daylight to dark, and lots of good things. Lots of things go wrong, and they did for everybody. But there was more good times than there ever was bad. Well, no one would live there otherwise. It wouldn't be worth being. And there is financial challenges, but I know in retrospect, in the flood times and the people that helped us, the neighbours and friends and our staff, people that sort of probably forgotten along the way, blokes like Andrew Forrest, he went out of his way to make sure that all our staff were employed, because we sort of didn't have any jobs left. And even after the clean-up, people sort of came back, members of the staff, of our staff, that came back and helped, and Ange Edwards and people like that who, came back and helped us. She lived and worked there and cooked. She was a cook and a camp cook, and they, lots of people like that we were able to surround ourselves with, and they've made our lives pretty big. And they always, you always think back to the people. A lot of them are gone now. They're dead and gone, particularly the Aboriginals that I grew up with. But I often think, there was limitations to a lot of people that we employed, but there was a lot of people that were very valuable employees, and they work for you, and you work with them. I know my father was always very proud of how long people work for him. And I share the same sort of feeling, there was a fellow called Ganger Reynolds, Kevin Gordon Reynolds. He was a Queenslander and drank too much and had a pretty haphazard life in many ways. And he worked for us for 25 years and went home, at the end of his sort of active life when he sort of reckoned he'd had enough, at 83, and had cancer for 15 years of that. And like very valuable people to have around you and with you. And I would say just that. It's the life we lived up there was a good life, a big life. It had its downs, but it had lots of ups. And for anyone that was contemplating that sort of life, that living in the outback, it's a privilege. And if you're going to do it, get on with it.